No single aircraft has seized the public's fascination quite like the North American P-51 Mustang fighter. In the perception of many, particularly the young combat pilots who operated it during Europe's final year of warfare, the P-51 enabled the Allies to achieve total air dominance over European skies. However, many accolades attributed to the Mustang don't align precisely with historical facts. While the aircraft ultimately evolved into an exceptional fighter, it certainly didn't begin that way. Remarkably, the Mustang's design emerged entirely by chance and resulted more from corporate ego than military requirements. Its later evolution was similarly accidental rather than intentional. The U.S. Army initially showed no interest in the aircraft, and the British expressed dissatisfaction when they received theirs. Prior to American involvement in the conflict, the British Purchasing Commission ordered various American-manufactured military aircraft, including Curtiss fighters equipped with Allison power plants, which the U.S. Army Air Corps had designated the P-40 Tomahawk. Curtiss couldn't meet British requirements and proposed that North American aircraft manufacture some aircraft under licensing arrangements. North American's president, West Virginian James S. Dutch Kindleberger, rejected this proposal. Instead, he suggested his company develop a completely new fighter designed around the identical Allison V-1710 power plant that drove the P-40. Kindleberger was confident his company could create an aerodynamically superior aircraft utilizing emerging mass production techniques recently introduced in American aviation manufacturing. The British requested preliminary design studies. North American promised an incredible 4-month timeline for prototype readiness. North American management persuaded Curtiss to provide P-40 design data, reducing the new fighter project's preliminary design phase by several months. The company assured the British that deliveries would commence in January 1941, producing 50 aircraft monthly through 1941's end. The British christened the aircraft Mustang, apparently adopting the name from wild horses roaming the American frontier, though no rationale for this selection exists. To reduce production timelines, North American chose a non-turbocharged Allison V-1710 variant, which would compromise high-altitude capabilities. When initial Mustangs reached England, Royal Air Force test pilots rapidly determined that while the new fighter demonstrated excellent agility and speed, performance deteriorated above 15,000 feet as naturally aspirated Allison engines lost power. Consequently, the RAF assigned Mustangs to Army Cooperation Command, which previously operated the nimble Westland Lysander as its principal aircraft. Mustangs received camera equipment and tactical reconnaissance assignments, continuing this role throughout the conflict. The RAF Mustang's first operational deployment supported the catastrophic Dieppe operation in August 1942. The U.S. Army Air Corps similarly assigned its initial Mustangs to support roles. 57 aircraft diverted from British production immediately following Pearl Harbor. Perhaps influenced by RAF Cooperation Command usage, the U.S. Army decided to modify the Mustang for dive bombing. At that time, the Army standard dive bomber was the Douglas Dauntless, designated A-24 by the Army. Unfortunately, inadequate defensive capabilities resulted in severe A-24 losses in the Southwest Pacific during early 1942. Undoubtedly influencing decisions to seek more maneuverable and better armed dive bombing designs. Dive brakes and hardpoints for bombs up to 1,000 pounds were incorporated into the basic design, creating the A-36 dive bomber. The 27th and 86th Bombardment Groups Light received A-36s and entered North African combat in spring 1943. RAF Mustangs also saw North African combat duty. Though primary British tactical fighters, there were Curtiss Kittyhawks and Hawker Hurricanes. The 311th Bombardment Group, also equipped with A-36s, deployed to China. Eventually, the U.S. Army concluded that dive bomber value had been overestimated, and despite producing over 300 A-36s, they were ultimately replaced by fighters or light and medium bombers. While dive bombing remained popular with Navy and Marine Corps units, the Army discontinued this practice. With the decision to assign new Mustangs to Cooperation Command, the Royal Air Force continued developing the already renowned Supermarine Spitfire as its primary interceptor. Nevertheless, some RAF test pilots believed that with high-altitude power plants, The Mustang would excel in air-to-air combat at typical European combat altitudes. The turbocharged Rolls-Royce Merlin was ideal, but entire Merlin 61 production was designated for Spitfires. To expand Merlin production, Rolls-Royce contracted with America's Packard Automobile Company for licensed engine manufacturing. Though famous for luxury vehicles, Packard had designed and manufactured the Liberty engine used during the Great War, powering U.S.-built aircraft into the 1920s. The first Merlin-powered British Mustang flight occurred in October 1942. A month later, a Packard Merlin-powered Mustang was produced for the U.S. Army and made its maiden flight. The Merlin engine transformed the Mustang. Comparisons between Mustangs and Spitfires revealed the North American design possessed significantly greater range, while high-altitude performance improved dramatically. This combination emerged at the perfect moment, as U.S. Army Air Force's European experience demonstrated the necessity for high-performance, long-range fighters. Throughout 1942 and most of 1943, Mustang fighters remained inactive, though a 36 and RAF cooperation variant saw combat, particularly in North Africa. However, European events were leading toward further Mustang development into the aircraft often called the war's finest Allied fighter. By summer 1942, the U.S. 8th Air Force conducted an escalating strategic bombing campaign against Axis targets in France and other occupied territories from English bases. In early 1943, daylight bombing expanded into German airspace. B-17 groups, comprising 8 bomber commands' primary strength, began suffering severe losses from German fighter attacks. 8th Air Force leadership had believed their 4-engine flying fortresses were appropriately named, but discovered otherwise when B-17s encountered Luftwaffe fighters. Particularly heavy losses in late summer and early fall 1943 led to canceling further daylight, deep penetration raids into Germany until long-range escort fighters could be developed. Throughout 1943, primary European escort fighters were RAF Spitfires and USAF Lockheed P-38 Lightnings and Republic P-47 Thunderbolts. While P-38s possessed Berlin range, P-47s were limited due to radial engine fuel consumption, and insufficient P-38s were available. All English P-38s transferred to North Africa early in the year and weren't replaced until late summer, leaving Spitfires as sole escorts until April when initial P-47s became operational. P-38s didn't return to English skies until September. Meanwhile, bombers lacked escorts beyond Spitfire operational range. USAF engineers at Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio, sought suitable escort fighters for rapid mass production, focusing on the Mustang. Merlin engine adoption resolved the Mustang's high-altitude performance issues, and the Mustang proved highly maneuverable with some restrictions, primarily due to weight and balance considerations. Increasing effective range was the primary challenge. Air Corps engineering facilities at Wright Field developed modifications to increase Mustang fuel capacity and extend combat range. Additional fuselage tanks complemented previously developed droppable external fuel tanks. Ironically, adopting the Mustang as primary escort fighter didn't immediately follow Merlin engine adoption. Initially, Merlin-powered P-51Bs were allocated to tactical air forces being formed for European ground support. The first P-51 equipped fighter group entering European combat was the 354th Fighter Group, arriving in England in October 1943 and immediately assigned to the newly organized 9th Air Force. The 9th had previously operated in the Mediterranean, but Allied North African victory led to its English transfer to become a tactical air force supporting Allied ground forces during the mid-1944 Western European invasion. Since the 9th was scheduled to include numerous fighter groups, the 8th Air Force requested temporary assignment of 9th fighters as bomber escorts. In November 1943, LT called Donald Blakeslee, 4th Fighter Group Deputy Commander and one of Europe's most experienced American fighter pilots, was assigned to fly with the 354th Fighter Group. Blakeslee was a former RAF Eagle Squadron Spitfire pilot who had flown Thunderbolts, and his P-47 displeasure was well known. Whether he engineered the 354th assignment or was selected to evaluate the group's P-51Bs remains unclear. His enthusiasm for the highly maneuverable aircraft is not. The new P-51's main advantage was reduced Merlin engine fuel consumption compared to the radial engine P-47, then the primary escort fighter. Initial English Mustangs carried only 184-gallon wing tanks, but reduced Merlin engine fuel consumption substantially increased range over similarly equipped P-47s. Plans included installing additional 85-gallon fuselage tanks, while wing hardpoints allowed an additional 150 gallons with two 75-gallon drop tanks. Blakeslee believed the Mustang solved the long-range escort problem, but all Mustangs were designated for the 9th Air Force. During winter 1943, Allied military planners in Europe prepared for Western European invasion, followed by advancement toward Germany. North African and New Guinea experiences revealed air power served as what became known as a force multiplier, an element assisting ground commanders in territory capture endeavors. The 9th Air Force was a tactical unit with the primary mission of supporting theater commanders, and massive efforts were underway to build fighter bomber and light and medium bomber forces supporting ground troops. Once troops landed in France, the European war would shift from primarily an air war against the Luftwaffe to ground warfare, with the ultimate objective being Berlin capture and German defeat. New Mustangs were viewed as ideal weapons for securing and maintaining battlefield air superiority and taking war to enemy rear areas. At this point, military politics emerged, as Blakeslee and 8th Fighter Command leaders maneuvered to transfer Mustangs to the 8th. They viewed the 8th Air Force mission as strategic bombardment and recognized that mission success required long-range escort fighters capable of accompanying bombers to deep German targets and fighting at high altitude. Much of Western Europe remained in German control, and strategic target aerial bombardment was still considered the primary Air Force mission. Their arguments found receptive audiences in English Army Air Force's headquarters and prevailed. Preparations began to equip nearly all 8 Fighter Command squadrons with new Mustangs. Meanwhile, IX Fighter Command P-51s and other fighters operated under 8th Air Force control and escort roles. 3 P-51 groups were scheduled for the 9th, but compromise led to assigning one group to the 8th in exchange for transferring the recently arrived 358th Fighter Group and its P-47s to 9th Air Force. 8th Fighter Command received the Mustang-equipped 357th and began planning to convert all P-47 and P-38 groups to Mustangs. One exception existed. The 56th Fighter Group was the first P-47 group and remained with Thunderbolts until war's end. The 56th, nicknamed the Wolfpack for hunting Germans like Wolfpacks, was the highest-scoring American fighter group in the European theater. The 56th finished the war with 674 claimed enemy aircraft destroyed in air combat and 311 destroyed on the ground. By contrast, Blakeslee's 4th Fighter Group, the first 8th group converting to P-51s and longest in European combat, finished with 583 air-to-air kills and 469 strafing claims. Although the 4th, which flew Spitfires and P-47s before transitioning to P-51s, was credited with slightly more total aircraft destroyed, the P-47-equipped 56th was credited with nearly 100 more air-to-air kills. So much for frequently stated assertions that the fabulous P-51 was the superior fighter. The third highest scoring group, however, flew only Mustangs. The 357th Fighter Group was 8 Fighter Command's first P-51 group, claiming 609 air-to-air kills and 106 ground destructions. Many writers incorrectly propose that Mustang appearance as escort fighters signaled Allied air superiority achievement over European skies. Actually, this wasn't the case. The P-51's advantage was that later models possessed range for deeper German penetration than P-47s, but longer-range Mustangs didn't appear in England until mid-spring 1944. By this time, Luftwaffe effectiveness was already declining due to numerous factors. Not least was petroleum supply interruption from Eastern European refineries, prompted largely by Soviet advance into oil-rich Balkans and transportation campaigns targeting railroads and bridges. The first European U.S. Army Mustangs lacked additional fuel tanks, providing later models with deep German range. Another reason existed for Luftwaffe decline. Throughout 1942 and 1943, German fighter pilots largely avoided Allied fighters, waiting beyond effective range and attacking bombers once escorts reached fuel limits and returned. By spring 1944, 8 Fighter Command had significantly extended P-38 and P-47 range through suitable external fuel tanks, enabling escorts to accompany bombers much deeper into German territory. In fact, twin-engine P-38s could accompany them all the way to Berlin. With increased fighter range, 8 Fighter Command authorized attacking Luftwaffe airfields to destroy German fighters on the ground and in air. By the time P-51s became available in Europe in large numbers, Allies were already achieving air superiority. Modifications converting Mustangs into long-range fighters weren't problem-free. When 85-gallon internal fuel tanks were added, test pilots discovered full tanks affected aircraft control during combat maneuvers. To utilize increased range, 8 Fighter Command was forced to fuel fighters so tanks contained no more than 35 gallons when reaching likely combat areas. Since external tanks caused drag and were normally burned first for dropping, the stability problem reduced effective Mustang range. Stability wasn't the only Mustang problem. They also experienced high-altitude heating deficiencies, which had plagued twin-engine P-38s during early combat months. It's commonly believed that once P-51s arrived in the European theater, P-47s were assigned solely to fighter-bomber roles while Mustangs flew only escort. This isn't accurate. With Mustang appearance, 8 Fighter Command adopted strategies assigning more experienced P-47 groups to patrol areas where Luftwaffe fighters were most likely to attack bomber streams, while longer-legged P-38s and P-51s accompanied bombers to targets. Mustangs were also used as fighter bombers, especially after Luftwaffe fighter squadrons were practically grounded due to gasoline and oil shortages. Thunderbolts and Lightnings continued flying escort missions until Mustangs replaced them in most 8 Fighter Command squadrons in late 1944. However, conversion didn't occur until comparatively late in the war as more Mustangs became available. Thunderbolts and Lightnings remained primary European escort fighters until mid-1944. Ironically, about the same time Mustangs began appearing in European skies in large numbers, air war moved downward, as providing close air support for ground troops became the primary Army Air Force's mission. While the Mustang became 8 Fighter Command's primary escort fighter, P-51s weren't absent from 9th Air Force Tactical Air Commands. Brig. General O.P. Whalen's XIX Tactical Air Command included 1 Mustang group when operational on July 31, 1944, supporting General George S. Patton's Third Army, and other Mustang groups transferred as operational needs changed. The Mustang faced major drawbacks in low-altitude attack. Liquid-cooled Merlin engines made P-51s more vulnerable to ground fire than radial-engine P-47s, so they were often assigned fighter cover over battlefields protecting against German aircraft. Thunderbolts carried 2 more machine guns than Mustangs and were better suited for attacking German armor and other ground targets. Still, P-51s flew their share of ground attack missions, using 6 .50 caliber machine guns for strafing and firing rockets and dropping bombs and napalm. 8th Air Force Mustangs often transferred to 9th Air Force control, particularly during battles to regain Allied initiative during the German Ardennes offensive in winter 1944-1945. Mustang-equipped groups entered 15th Air Force combat from Italian bases in late spring 1944, when 3 groups flying P-40s received P-51s. The 12th Air Force's 52nd Fighter Group also traded Spitfires for Mustangs. A 4th 15th Air Force group receiving P-51s was the controversial 332nd Fighter Group, an all-black unit popularly associated with Tuskegee Airmen, which had most recently flown P-47s. Group pilots painted aircraft tails red, making them easily identifiable to friend and foe. Group members later claimed they never lost a bomber during escort missions, although qualifications for such claims are somewhat unclear. With Merlin-powered Mustang appearance and acceptance, the Army Air Forces began planning to eliminate other aircraft production to standardize maintenance and supply roles. However, not all combat commanders shared 8 Fighter Command's Brig. General William Kepner's Mustang enthusiasm. When notified by headquarters, U.S. Army Air Forces, that is Command's P-38s and P-47s, would be replaced by P-51's Far East Air Force's Commander Lt. General George C. Kenney flatly refused. Early in the war, Kenney had told General Henry H. Arnold he didn't care what aircraft types he received in his theater, but as the war continued, he developed twin-engine P-38 preferences. Kenney commanded a theater encompassing vast water expanses, and he felt the P-38's second engine gave pilots return chances the P-51 couldn't offer. Furthermore, 5th and 13th Air Force P-38s in the Pacific had effectively shot down Japanese aircraft since their combat debut in late 1942. By mid-1944, Far East Air Force's P-38s were flying 700-mile missions, distances far exceeding European encounters. The P-38 remained Far East Air Force's preferred fighter until war's end. Despite General Kenney's initial refusal to accept Mustangs as veteran fighter squadron replacements, some newly arriving units received P-51s. In early 1945, the 460th Fighter Squadron joined the P-47-equipped 348th Fighter Group with P-51s, and the rest of the group began transitioning to more maneuverable fighters. The Southwest Pacific's first Mustangs were actually F-6D reconnaissance aircraft beginning operations in late 1944 with the 82nd Reconnaissance Squadron. Days after entering combat, Captain William Shomo, squadron commander, was on a photography flight when he and his wingman encountered a formation of 13 Japanese aircraft, 1 bomber and 12 fighter escorts. Although both Shomo and wingman Lieutenant Paul Lipscomb were inexperienced rookies, they managed to shoot down the bomber and 10 escorts. For their actions, Shomo received the Medal of Honor and Lipscomb the Distinguished Service Cross. Other Mustangs operated in the Southwest Pacific with the 3rd Air Commando Group. Air Commandos also brought Mustang fighters to the China-Burma-India Theater, where P-51s played major roles with the 14th Air Force during the war's final year. After initially supporting British long-range ground operations in Burma, Air Commando Mustangs were used primarily for ground attack, particularly against Japanese airfields and supply routes. Air Commando Mustangs weren't first in the CBI, however. Agile fighters entered theater service in mid-1943 when the 311th Bombardment Group arrived with 2 A-36 squadrons and 1 early-model Allison-equipped P-51A squadron. They were joined by the 8th Photo Reconnaissance Group flying F-6 versions. Mustangs later replaced Curtiss P-40s in the famous 23rd Fighter Group, the Army Air Corps unit replacing the American Volunteer Group known as Flying Tigers in early 1942 after United States war entry. During the war's final months, the Army Air Forces also began assigning P-51s to the Central Pacific to escort Boeing B-29 Superfortresses flying long-range bombing missions over Japanese home islands from Marianas bases. To secure forward P-51 bases, U.S. Marines landed on Iwo Jima, an island 660 miles southeast of Japanese home islands. The first Japan mission occurred on April 29, 1945, when 108 P-51s escorted B-29s. Mustangs were also based on Okinawa, joining other American fighters in ground attack aircraft on Japan's sweeps. As the Mustang's first customer, the British Royal Air Force continued using the type in various roles throughout the war. After initial reconnaissance use, RAF Mustangs served as escort fighters in ground attack aircraft in Asia, Europe, and the Mediterranean. Mustangs also served with the Royal Australian Air Force, Royal Canadian Air Force, Netherlands East Indies Air Force, and South African Air Force, though the SOF was operational only during the war's final weeks. Ironically, the feature making the Lockheed P-38 the favored Southwest Pacific fighter led North American to propose developing a twin-engine Mustang version. North American carried their design further than Lockheed by adding a second pilot. Essentially, the twin Mustang, designated F-82 by the U.S. Army, was 2 P-51 fuselages joined with a short wing and single stabilizer connecting both. Production began in early 1945. But only 20 were produced by war's end. Author Sam McGowan is also a pilot residing in the Houston, Texas area.